Welcome inside the digital hub, Denmark. Please welcome to the stage Rolf Kjærgaard, Rikke Hougaard, Frederic Lardinois, Dr. Tanya and Daniel Korski.
All right, GovTech. Government and technology, government and innovation. I thought about that when they invited me to do this. It sounds like a contradiction to me. It's how much innovation can there really be in government technology? You want to take that?
Sure. Just to introduce myself briefly, my name's Tanya and I work at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, which was set up just about a year and a half ago to rethink public policy in and for the 21st century. So these kinds of questions are very much on our mind. I think a good starting point is maybe to think about some of the kind of typical ideas about government. And often, as you say, innovation doesn't come into that framework. So maybe we should start with one of them, which is accurate. So it doesn't necessarily say government is innovative, and it's accurate, which is that governments in many countries, in many parts of the world, are aging. They're old. And I'm not just talking about the institutions, but I'm talking about the people who work in them. So just to take the example of the US quickly, 45% of the federal workforce will be eligible for retirement in the next 10 years. 7% of the federal workforce is under the age of 30. The government isn't reskilling itself for the 21st century at the pace that it needs to be. So I think there's a grain of truth in your skepticism, but I think over the course of the discussion, we'll also hear some other sides of the story.
I hope so. It's your job to convince me otherwise.
I am Rikke Zeberg. I'm the director of the Agency of Digitisation here in Denmark. And when it comes to innovation and the public sector, I say that the minister just told everybody that Denmark is one of the leading countries when it comes to digitization of the public sector. Very early on, we took some bold decisions about how to digitize the public sector. And that means today we deliver one of the most digitized public sector in the world. It's efficient and it gives a good service to people. We have to talk about innovation, but indeed we have a good starting place, and we have been very good so far.
Rolf Kjærgaard, CEO at Vækstfonden, recently appointed. We're very happy about that, especially because when we talk about GovTech and talk about all the other tech areas within a Danish context, there's so many opportunities out there to be seized upon. And in the GovTech space, our approach really is an investor's approach. We have you were saying probably the most digitized. Maybe that's a Carlsberg statement. I've seen numbers stating that we have the most digitized public sector in the entire world. Now that's a huge asset in our perspective. From that, definitely great ideas, great new companies can emerge, and they have emerged. We need to focus all our attention on creating those pathways whereby this innovation that comes from the inside of government can get out and be commercialized and be the foundation for new companies. And we need to inject capital along the way. And that's really what this whole collaborative effort is all about, where Vækstfonden is just one piece of that puzzle.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Daniel Korski. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Public. We are a venture firm focused on GovTech, where we run what is probably Europe's largest public sector-focused accelerator program, GovStart. And with Rikke and the business ministry, we help operate the Danish government's GovTech program. And I guess I have to believe that you're wrong, because if you're not wrong, then I'm in deep trouble, because our entire business has been built around this idea that while technology has perhaps been slow to transform public services compared to retail and financial services, there is a real transformation underway. There's an availability of new and exciting technologies developed and promoted by new companies, but there's also a really interesting willingness. Tanya talks about that demographic gap. But there are also lots of young people coming into the public sector, and they are living these dual lives. On the one hand, they're living an incredibly digitized home life on their smartphone, ordering their holidays, Snapchatting with their friends, and then they go into a ministry and they're carrying around lots of paperwork from court to court.
Oh, Daniel, there's not. I don't think.
Okay, but I think there's a pressure, which is a very positive pressure, and so I don't see these things as incompatible, and I think it's unfair on public servants to say, if you're a public servant, you're not innovative, and if you're an entrepreneur, you are, because that's not really the reality any longer.
How do you bring those two? And I like to think that old people can be innovative too,
I agree.
but that's a different question. How do you bring those two worlds together? That world of maybe the government organization, it might have lots of innovative people in it, but that doesn't know how to use that kind of energy. How do you bring that together?
I mean, I can speak for the entrepreneur side, and Rikke, maybe you feel better placed on the public sector side. But for on the entrepreneur side, I think it's a lot about, as in any business, if you're trying to sell to a client, you've got to understand the client. You've got to understand their needs, and you've got to show some empathy for what they are interested in. And that is perhaps doubly important when it comes to the public sector, and harder to get close to understanding. So from the entrepreneur side, what we do when we work with early stage companies is to try to get them to understand how to fit their product to market, how to speak a language that public sector officials recognize, how to understand the dynamics and the incentives that are at work, with their customers. And I think that at least brings those companies to a stage where they can engage in a dialogue.
I have to say, the picture that you're drawing of the public sector as being old, filled with old people, and we're carrying around paperwork, but that is not maybe there's some people thinking that, but that's not the Danish public sector. Actually, as I started with to say, we are one of the most digitized public sector in the world, and actually we've been digitized for many years. So right now we are standing where we need new systems for a lot of the things we have. We have an EID, who's every Dane, every business in Denmark has one, and now we stand at a point where we have to develop a new one. We have to make a new digital mailbox for every Danes who also have that. One of the only places in the world where it's the only place in the world where it's mandatory to have a digital mailbox. And right now we are developing all these new systems. And we're doing it together with some of the big IT businesses in the market. So I mean that we are doing that. We're working agile now. We have a lot of young people who are thinking in new ways in the public sector. But what we should be discussing today is how we can enforce some of the startups, some of the small companies to have a new growth history, so they can grow up and being some of the big companies in the future. And also about the students, that we have some very brilliant students in Denmark at the universities, and I don't think we are capable enough to make use of all the knowledge that's there in the public sector and have them work together. So the picture where you're drawing, where we have an old public sector, is not there where we are, but we need to focus on the startups and how we can make more innovation and get use of that in the public sector. And that's exactly what the GovTech program is about.
Well, how do you do that?
How we do it?
Yeah.
We got Daniel to help us. But what is actually the program is about is that instead of in Denmark or a lot of places in the public sector, we do that when we have a new system that we should have made. We make a long procurement, big tenders, where the public sector decide what kind of system do we need for this to solve this problem, and then we give it to the market. And the basic idea here is that instead of the public sector is finding the solutions, we say we have this problem we want to have solved, and then we give it to the market and said, help us to get the best solution.
And you're working with Daniel. What about the venture capital side of the business? And are you working with venture capitalists?
Absolutely, we're part of that program as well. And when it comes to ways in which you can build that mode of interaction between the public sector and the private sector, and especially the startup community. I think this is really both a novel and a very rewarding approach, that of putting out some real issues, some real problems that the Danish public sector is tackling with these days, and then allow for all the entrepreneurship and development skills and the innovative capabilities of startups out there to go ahead at trying to solve these issues. And from that, most certainly, will follow solutions for the issues at hand. But the greater benefits will definitely be, in many of those cases, that these startups get their initial customers, some great reference cases to go out there and tout to the world that they have buying customers, and they're not just any other customer. Now, this is the government sector that is the key customer to these startups, and we all know how governments really need to have their act in order, and so if you can qualify with those requirements that the government sector puts out there, then the private sector should lay open, essentially. And that's another thing we need to recognize, that it's not all about finding solutions that only work in the public sector. For a lot of those applications out there, for a lot of those companies that we're funding and that we're working with, they have solutions that might just as well be applied in the private sector. And then you have a different type of dual use, essentially, and you can build out your customer base, attacking both the public sector as well as the private sector. So there's some great opportunities out there. We need to have an open mind about how GovTech can lead to global tech, essentially.
I think it's worth remembering that it's not the case that government and technology firms have never worked together before. There's a long history of those kinds of relationships. But what GovTech is really about is resetting that relationship, actually. So moving beyond an idea that it's a typical client-vendor relationship where the technology company is sort of left to get on with it after a procurement, but actually to think about government having a more multifaceted role within the GovTech ecosystem. And part of that certainly is about being knowledgeable procurers and ensuring that on the part of the state there's that knowledge to be able to procure effectively and responsibly. But it's also about at other parts of the life cycle of any given technology project, so that they can be real partners, provide project oversight where necessary, especially, today we're moving towards the procurement of more advanced technologies as well in the government space, including things like decision-making technologies for issues like foster care or refugee location. So these are clearly very weighty issues, and it's incredibly important that policymakers have the tools to provide oversight when these kinds of technology projects are being delivered. And I guess I would also add one further role, which is around measurement and evaluation. So I think that's also another government responsibility in this space, to think about whether the projects are successful and what success looks like.
What does success look like for you? And I want to talk about procurement quite a bit as well, but when you think about bringing on startup technologies into the government, what does success look like for you?
It's a difficult question, because right now we have these huge tender processes, and we have huge projects, and one of the issues in all over the world in the government is that these huge IT projects, when they fail, right. You can't fail, because you serve the citizens and have to make services to citizens. So what we've done here is in this program, we have to start as some pilots where we get some experiences. How is this going to work? How can we work with the tender rules, which is the EU legislation? How can we work with that to to make new innovative ways of working together. You can't start by making a whole new big system for an EID in this way, but we have to find these problems around the public sector we can put out and have some experiences how we do this. And then I definitely believe that's the way we have to do it.
I think it's worth just taking a step back and say, why are we talking about this? Why are we, I mean, yes, it's cool and sexy to talk about startups, but why do we think that startups and public services, could work well together? And I think the reason why is we know startups operate in a very different way than other small businesses that have been around for a long time. They're usually venture-backed in order to achieve to overcome existing problems that nobody has quite found their way around, and they're culturally and financially strapped in order to do so at a very fast rate. That's really what a startup is. It's what a startup does in retail and financial. And so, there is enormous value that cultural and financial construct can provide to a public sector that is dealing with aging populations and lots of different kinds of demands. So that's kind of why we're talking about it. But I do think it's fair, before we sort of get into the mechanics of procurement, to talk a little bit about the journey everybody needs to go on. The GovTech program does not in any way assume that if it succeeds, it'll transform all Danish public services. But as Rikke says, it is the beginning of showing how a different approach, not saying down to the last specification what the government wants, but allowing that kind of energy that exists in a startup to kind of be brought to bear and help define new ways of solving a problem. So that's the sort of part of the journey. Another part of the journey is also allowing public servants to be, if you were given the space, to think and operate differently with a market player, to Tanya's point. Not for them to be totally constrained by large existing processes. So that's partly what a program like the GovTech program tries to do.
And I think another point that we need to throw out there is that the moment we start fostering engagement and involvement between the government and startups, errors will be made. Mistakes will occur, because that's just the nature of startups. They're not all going to survive. So we need to appreciate the fact that when we do engage with a startup on a critical problem that needs an equally critical solution, then in most cases it will work, but in some cases it won't. And when it doesn't work, then it's okay, because that's just part of this innovative, creative process that you get from working with someone who's not one of the large global consultancies who are all hooked up in their long legacy and traditional ways of doing things, which is all great in many cases, but in these other cases where we're wanting to tap into the richness that lies within the startup community, then we need to make ourselves comfortable with the fact that it won't all work. But we'll get so many more benefits from tapping into those resources, and that's why we should do it.
And I agree so much, and that's exactly why we need a new approach to how we do it do business in the public sector when it comes to the IT, because all these huge procurements and tenders we're making, where we're making a long list of what the systems could do in the end, there's no room for failure in those way of doing the tenders. So we need to find new ways on how to work together to make trial and error, but also that we can make it smaller scale, actually, when we have to when we reach for the solution.
And iterate, maybe, because we've talked about sort of success over here and failure over here, but the reality is that most startups in most sectors succeed by iterating fast. Try this, does it work, what did we learn? Okay, ship another development, try that, and that, it isn't just that we struggle, all of us, with accepting failure in the public sector, but also we struggle with iteration. We want when we buy something, we want the finished product to be delivered. But for certain things, even if we've got to create, kind of a reservation of experimentation, we need to create some kind of way in which we also allow to iterate, because then you get the best out of these companies.
And that's what is also give us a speed, and that's also a problem for the public sector today, because when we start a new project, it gets 4 or 5 years later, we get the solution. And with the fast development, we need to get the speed, and that's also a huge problem for the public sector. And this way, if we can find new ways where we can have the products faster, fail faster, find the solutions faster, it will also be a huge benefit for public sector.
I think there are also 2 dimensions to this question of what success looks like from the perspective of government GovTech programs. So what I've noticed in a few different countries is that there are 2 primary objectives, although it's not always articulated like this. So one of them is very much about bringing innovation into the domestic public sector and changing how it works. And the other is about industry creation, so creating an industry of startups that can also sell into other countries and contribute to economic growth. Those objectives are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they feed into each other very well, but they're not the same. And therefore, understanding what success looks like is rather contingent on which one of those or what combination of those that you're going for. And then, going back to the point about measurement, measuring effectively and evaluating effectively along the way. And along the way is important to remember, precisely to this point about iteration, in order to be able to introduce policy tweaks along the way if you find that the objective isn't quite being met.
Now, from the startup's perspective, it's pretty clear what success looks like, because it means selling to the government and maybe to enterprises and others as well, and doing that a lot, because one other definition of a startup is a company that's scaling very rapidly. Is that even an option for a GovTech startup to scale that quickly, that a VC here or in Silicon Valley would really be all that interested in a GovTech company?
Why don't we ask TradeShift that question?
You would consider them a GovTech company?
That's how it originated. And now we're talking about one of the growing number of unicorns to come out of the Denmark and the Nordic region. So yeah, you should not limit yourself at the outset to only talking about selling to the government sector. You should always be open to opportunities for branching into the private sector, and there for most startups. I tell you, there will be opportunities in both sectors. And then you have multiple governments around the world, and you have sub-levels of government, and that means you can definitely scale a GovTech-originated startup, just like any other tech-originated startup.
So there's some good history here, right? Oracle, the large American company. Do you know where the word Oracle comes from? It was the project that Larry Ellison convinced the CIA to work with him on. It was called Project Oracle, and from Project Oracle, an initial seed investment by the CIA, came Oracle, the company. Palantir, the sort of contemporary equivalent, is also a GovTech company, now valued at God knows what, $30 billion or so. And in Europe, we have been slower, but there are great examples, and we are seeing larger and larger rounds and more companies willing to scale, sometimes in Europe, sometimes in the US and North America, sometimes elsewhere. So this is definitely something that's coming. I just would like to challenge an assumption that all startup growth is the same or on the same curve. There's a huge difference from B2C to enterprise sales. And if you have tried to sell to HP or General Electric, or in this context maybe Maersk or any of the larger Grundfos, Danfoss, you, I'm sure, will bear the scars on your back. That is not an easy sales process, and the journey is not as hockey stick steep as the B2C equivalent is. But on the other hand, there is longevity in those kind of enterprise sales, same with government sales. There's enormous credibility that comes from anchor customers like that. So I think we also have to sort of compare like for like. And I also think there's another dimension, and it was something that sort of I thought of, Tanya, when you were speaking, which is, and I hope this isn't too coarse to say, but it is enormously sensitive what kind of technology we deploy in our public sector. Not least because it touches on everybody's lives, and it touches on people who may not be able to make judgments for a variety of reasons, whether they want to be touched by it or not. And so it's hugely important that we are comfortable not just with the oversight that Tanya talks about, but with the ethical framework that companies are operating in. And if you zoom out, I can't help but ask myself this question. Would I like the technology that powers the Danish state to be built in China? Would I like it to be built in America? Or would I like there to be a thriving Nordic GovTech scene anchored in a country like Denmark that isn't only producing great products and great companies, but also built on great values that I am slightly more comfortable with? Other people will feel differently. We're all different. Some people will say it doesn't matter. Price is most important. But to me, that ethical dimension is not unimportant. And you can only really ensure that by inculcating a domestic system or a Nordic or European system that ascribes to those kind of values.
I do think it's important to think about these two questions of what success looks like for governments and success looks like for startups and investors together. Because a lot of governments are interested in GovTech because they want to increase competition for public sector contracts and therefore hopefully drive up quality. And in some instances also drive out corruption in the process. Now, in the short term, I absolutely see how that works. But thinking a little bit longer term, a number of the larger acquisitions that we've seen in this space are from the corporate venture arms of large technology companies that already sell into government. And some of it, so we've seen both investment, presumably with an ITA acquisition, and acquisition itself. Now that to me doesn't say in the long run that GovTech by default as a sector leads to greater competition for public sector contracts. What it does say is that we need to think carefully about the way and the qualities of investment that is offered to startups in the space. And not just at the very early pre-seed, seed stage, but later on. To encourage competition, you need access to capital. That means that you don't immediately have to go for acquisition. And of course, you also need access to skills, a talented workforce. So I think it's important to think about that kind of longer-term ecosystem shaping as well.
I would like to say we have to remember also why are we digitizing the public sector, and we do it for at least two reasons. And the one is that we create a better service for the citizens. When the citizens and the businesses today, they are in the digitized world, they also expect the public sector to deliver the service at a certain level, and the digitization can give them that. That's one point. The other point is that it also makes an efficient public sector. With the digitization, we make it more efficient, and then we can spend more money on the direct welfare with a priority for the government. So that's two very important objectives. So that's why we digitize the public sector. And then also we have the competition, then there's some following of that. As you said, with the competition, we also want that. And also, we need to empower the universities in Denmark, the students, and we have a common goal here to make use of all the knowledge that are at the universities. And I have to admit, I don't think we have been good at that in Denmark, in the public sector, to get that use. And also that's why we want to enter these programs also to get the empowerment for the big growth of the startups or for the students, and create something more value added of all the money we use in the public sector and put into the IT market.
If I can just speak to the point about universities, if we think historically, if we think about any innovation ecosystem, I would struggle to think of one where universities haven't played a key role at almost every point of the innovation life cycle. So right from the beginning, the research and development dimension, but also through to later commercialization stages. And we're not seeing much of it in GovTech. We're really not. And I think it's incredibly important, there's of course the formal educational dimension at universities, but I think it's really important to be creating as many spaces and opportunities for students from different disciplines across the technology, social sciences border to be in one room talking about these topics together, because they are the future investors, future policymakers, future founders, and it's incredibly important that they're speaking the same language right from before they start their careers, so that we don't replicate this system of silos and fragmentation between the sectors.
Now
can I just quickly pick up on that? I so agree, and I find it so interesting that you can go to universities and still see if you go to a political science faculty, technology is kind of still sort of weirdly bolted on to the core of the curriculum. And similarly, if you go to a more technical-minded university, then the politics is kind of a sort of add-on for those weird people who are interested in that interface. And I think it is getting better, and it's not just, my comment isn't so much about Denmark as much about universities I've seen everywhere. I'm really struck that there isn't anywhere globally, and maybe the Bennett Institute in Cambridge will become that, that has set itself up to say, no, we are going to have the National School of Government and Technology, and it may be brought together by different universities that each bring something else, but this is the place we are trying to educate the future, digital official. Because if you think back historically, who created the world around us? People who came out of particular educational establishments after the Second World War, who had shared a certain wartime experience, who had all been educated in a very similar canon of thought. That canon is now being transformed by technology, and we now kind of need to develop a new canon and a new place for people to go.
From the venture capital side, and that's kind of picking up on what you were talking about in the universities, do you find that the GovTech entrepreneur is different from the consumer startup entrepreneur that you encounter? Is there a different profile of founders?
I wouldn't say that I've been struck by different profiles, really, but the approach to selling is different, and that's getting back to your point about the sales cycle dynamics being profoundly different from enterprise sales to selling to the government. And perhaps more startups out there who are just driven by that desire to build their own company should recognize that fact, because government agencies don't see themselves as competitors. So if you have sold to a government agency a revolutionary breakthrough solution, then they're going to tell that to all the other agencies, and they're going to, those recommendations are going to travel cross-border and proliferate from there. So you can tap into what, to some extent, are network effects from selling B2G as opposed to B2C, where or B2B, where if you're selling to one company in one industry, then they're not as likely to go and tell their competitors that they have this competitive edge because now they have this great solution running their operations. So that really is a very interesting market or sales dynamic that can fuel startup selling and startup growth.
So I kind of feel like answering the question by talking about the philanthropic focus in the Valley by a lot of founders, which is recently what we've seen in the Valley is a lot of funding by a lot of the founders into cancer research. And well, why is that? Well, it's probably not unrelated to the fact that a lot of the people who've done really well over the last 20 years in the Valley, who are now running companies or exited companies, are now hitting a demographic moment where this is suddenly becoming really personal.
What a cynical view.
I look, like all families, I have had my family affected by cancer, but it's simply to say that there is something going on that has to be explained somewhere. But why do I want to talk about that? Because what I see is increasingly people coming out of the tech sector, having built a great app that gets a pizza to you faster than anybody else, having built a great site with better UX, and to download your famous TV series, and they're increasingly interested in doing something bigger, doing something with impact, doing something that has a lasting effect, doing something for society. And so when we look at founders, we see a lot of people coming out of different sectors. They weren't GovTech before, but they may have made some money, they may have learned some things, and they kind of feel like the next startup I do has to do something bigger. So we see that. And the second thing we increasingly see people coming out of the public sector thinking, I too can build a company. Now, some of them can, some of them can't, but we kind of increasingly see that led primarily by the medical profession, where most sort of doctors, surgeons, they're like, there's this thing that I just could really use here, and I know it because I've stood in the operating theater for 10 years, and I just want that thing. But we also increasingly see it in police and military, people who've been very close to the problem and have developed a solution, and now kind of think that the cost of construction, by which I mean the cost of capital, the ease of access to technology, is so low that it's not impossible for them to get into the game too.
Let's talk strategy for a moment. We talked about procurement. Let's maybe get down to the nitty-gritty, the boring part. From the government perspective...
It's too warm for the boring part.
It sure is warm here. But what are you seeing are the biggest mistakes that these startups make when they try to sell to governments and the public sector?
That's a hard question from my chair. I think that maybe it's something about how the sectors look at each other, how the startups look at the public sector. I often hear that a lot of the startups, they give up before they even got started because it's so difficult to do business with the public sector. I think then some of the big tenders, of course, there's problems, but also I think that there's a lot of, throughout the country, there's actually a lot of the startups that is doing business with some of the, maybe not in the states, in the agencies, but at the municipality level, or at a certain hospitals. Maybe it's more decentralized, where it's smaller. But I think that one of the important things is that we need to change the culture. We need to change the culture in the public sector, and we need to change the culture also by the startups, so we can start talking together. And that's one of also the program's goals, that we should learn each other's language and get some definitions of how we can do business together. So I think it's not. We always talk about the tender rules as it's totally difficult and totally impossible for small companies to do business with public sector. And actually, there will be some ways we can do it, but we just need to talk about how to do it to get more clearance about it.
There's an article in The Economist this week with the headline, "I'm from a business, I'm here to help." And that article is really about businesses that are emphasizing purpose, mission-driven approaches, but not necessarily that are trying to work with governments. And I see this globally. I've recently completed a large piece of work for a regional development bank in Latin America. And there, the consistent message from the startup side is that they are developing products that have a public purpose, but they are not even attempting to sell them into government. So you essentially have this parallel system in place. I think what all of us are saying, and many other people in the GovTech ecosystem, is government really matters. And actually, one way to scale your efforts is to sell into them. And of course, that has to be facilitated. But I think there's also that obstacle on the startup side. The very idea of selling into government is incredibly foreign to them. And even if they do have a very public-driven approach, they don't see partnering with government as the way to do that.
So like there's shadow IT, there's shadow
Exactly.
GovTech that just bypasses the government.
Yeah, and especially, for example, with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is on everybody's mind at the moment, how do you scale approaches to meeting some of those objectives? It has to be in partnership across the sectors, and GovTech is, at the core of that.
I totally hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think we mustn't, I submit, think that anything that happens outside of the government is by definition bad without supervision and the rest of it, because I think what technology is also allowing us to do is to solve some of these big problems without having to go through the government, burdening the taxpayer. The question then is, how do you provide oversight over some of these things? I totally accept that. But what I find so fascinating is technology and is allowing things to emerge that the government hasn't thought about or hasn't thought about solving, and will probably not be able to prioritize solving. But if it creates a good, and if it can create another revenue stream to sustain that good, all the better for it. And so I think it's important that when we talk about GovTech, we kind of appreciate the breadth of the concept. Yes, it's about the email inbox that Rikke talked about, but it's also potentially about Tradeshift that Rolf talked about, and it's about lots of other companies that we see. I think there's this really interesting question, which is, well, how do we maintain some kind of quality insurance? How do we ensure that there's equitable distribution of services in a society? And those are fascinating questions that I certainly don't have the answer to, but I do see a lot of entrepreneurs who are saying, hey, I can solve this thing. And I do see a lot of governments saying, we love that, but we don't really have a tender. We're really not going to go to tender. But we still want that stuff to happen.
Is there a way out for the government to then actually help? Because we talked about that a bit. How can you then work with these startups if there is no tender process, if you just find something interesting you want to start working with?
Yeah, but that's exactly what the program, why we're starting with the business, the Ministry of Business. We're starting this program to find new ways to work together with the startups. And as I said before, we have to try to find the new ways of doing businesses. So I think we have the second round of the program is in the pipeline, and I think that's it's going to be good. But it's a huge culture change. There also has to be in public sector, and it's not doing over the night. So it will take some time before we get there, and we have to try with these pilot projects, and then also find solutions to some of the problems that will come along the way. But the important thing is that both the startup community and the public sector is in the program together.
That goes, if I may expand upon that, that goes back to that notion about the ecosystem. That whole idea of thinking about this in an ecosystem perspective really does drive a lot of that cultural change, a lot of that interaction, a lot of that investor attention, a lot of that government spending. Really, it will get that positive spiral going if we all agree that there are opportunities to be had from making the different sides get together. You talked about the university sector. Well, that's a critical component within a thriving ecosystem. So we need to crack that code of why isn't there, if there isn't, sufficient university research within the GovTech space, and if it's there, and whatever is there, how do we make sure that that is easily translated into commercial purposes and foundations for startups and commercial success, and then. We'll get some positive feedback going, really. So one of an added benefit from all of this and these programs is that it gets everyone talking about GovTech as a possible cluster, a possible ecosystem within the broader ecosystem. Just like the minister before we got on stage talked about how the robotics cluster emerged within Denmark. Not overnight, it took 30 years, but there were some components out there, some dots on the map that when properly connected, great things emerged. And we firmly believe that we can do something within the GovTech space in Denmark. We have all of the critical components in place. We just need to go ahead.
And then we also should remember that every ministry in Denmark, every agency is working with digitization. They're working with digitize all their administrative systems and all their services to the citizens. And the GovTech program is one of the many initiatives we have on the digitization agenda in Denmark. So it's a new way of looking at how we do businesses with startups from public sector. But there's a whole area of very innovative projects that are coming along from the government, and everybody is struggling with how to work more agile, how to break down the huge projects we have had to smaller projects, and all that also goes in direction of involving the smaller businesses. So it's not the GovTech's program, as we discussed today, it doesn't stand alone. We have a whole bunch of other initiatives as well.
As far as government-sponsored GovTech programs go, how much evidence is there that they actually work?
Well, they're very young. Some of the pioneering programs have, been discussed today. So the simple answer is, it's hard to say. Most are, under 2-3 years old. There's not much data available on the long-run success. I think what we can say is we know that accelerators can produce good results. There are evidence bases for broader technology sector programs of this nature. But the simple answer is it's too early to say. And as I say, I think it's important to measure early and often in order to provide tweaks with these kinds of programs as they develop over the next few years.
I guess I would just take it back and say, programs like the GovTech program in Denmark are the latest iteration of governments seeking to support, digital transformation of a sector. DARPA in the US have done so for years in the military. The Israeli defense establishment have done so for many years, but so have many others. And this is, in a way, the latest iteration, taking on board learnings from other sectors in order to see if that can provide the catalytic change that we want to see. And I think, to Rolf's point, if it's creating a different kind of conversation than the one that we had before, then that in and of itself, I think, could be potentially transformative, far beyond what the individual program is. But simply to say, some of the programs that we have both observed or backed companies that have come out of or run, we see companies that enter programs like that and leave as much more mature companies, having understood their customer in a fundamentally different way, adjusted their product, or qualified themselves out of the GovTech sector, which can be just as important. Don't spend your time on that if actually what you need to be chasing is shipping. So we see a lot of value for the startups. I would like to think that there's a lot of value for the public sector side, not for me to answer, but I certainly see a lot of transformative impact.
I would also just like to link this to the question about universities and students. There is student interest, in jobs with public purpose. There's student interest in working in the public sector, certainly. Just looking at the UK, I was looking at data from our Fast Stream program, which brings elite graduates into the public sector. And in 2017, there were 12,000 applicants for 80 places on the diplomatic stream. In the same year, there were under 2,000 for the same number of jobs in data and technology, which says to me that apart from anything else, there's an image problem specifically around data and technology in government. The diplomatic stream is still seen as really attractive, exciting, adventurous.
You get a big house, you get some chocolate, startup, you have to wait 20 years and a good exit to get that.
Data and technology is not seen in that way. So we need to think about how do you remake that image? And obviously there's a compensation dimension as well, which is that if you are, leaving university as an engineer, there are plentiful jobs that are going to pay you a lot more than a typical public sector role. We need to address that dimension. But I think the image part is key as well. And one thing I would say is that accelerator programs and things like that are run by governments, I think can help with that, as part of a broader rethinking of how we bring people in.
All right, I hope we've done some of that today. Our time is up before they kick us off this stage. But no, we could still talk for another hour and not exhaust all the topics in GovTech. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you guys.